Professor Furlong has seen the education studies or discipline of education as he calls it. He had painted a big picture. I would get inside it and try to look at education studies. How does it look from inside? I think that, I do not know whether he would agree, but I think that what I'm going to say actually complements what he has been saying. Any discipline or any field of studies obviously has very important socio-political forces shaping it and does have a social structures of it. But at the same time, perhaps there is something in it which also could be a source of unity of that discipline in itself, which may not be constructed by the socio-political considerations. So I would look more from that angle. Another qualification for what I'm saying from the very beginning is that obviously education studies is a practical field or applied field, and therefore it has a very strong and absolutely necessary part of practice and therefore practical wisdom. Today I'll be talking more on the theoretical aspect of it, though that does not mean that in any way practical aspect or practical wisdom is less important in that. This is just the choice of the paper I'm making. Now, idea of this paper emerged out of an in-depth and prolonged deliberation with some colleagues in the practical activity of developing curriculum for an MA education program. The people who were involved in this activity all were working in education, teaching in education. This kind of critical judgment and action in education obviously demanded what are the kinds of things which should be taught to these students. And without going into the details of the group, very quickly it at least emerged in my mind that what we are debating is what is education studies. There were many views, all very well considered, all very well intentioned, but also there were severe difficulties in reconciling those views. And it seemed to me that what we are debating through this activity of formulating a curriculum is the nature of education studies. And perhaps the three main questions about the nature and about the education studies. One of them I would call, or one could be formulated, that what knowledge base is necessary for a postgraduate program in education studies. Now this question could be formulated for MA, MEd or BEd or BA education, etc. But what is being asked is the criteria for necessity of including knowledge in that particular program, and that could emerge only with some view of education studies, otherwise that seems to be impossible. The second thing perhaps we were asking was what knowledge base can be considered more or less sufficient for this. So one is what is absolutely necessary, and another is would that be sufficient and would we like to add something more, and perhaps that could be called criteria for sufficiency. And the third important question which emerged was as this knowledge is organized, suppose we choose it, as it is recognized that education studies have to include various disciplines like sociology, psychology, history, and various kinds of practical skills, etc. So what would be the principle of coherence in all this? Are they going to be separate, independent fields of study just collected together, or could there be a principle of coherence? So therefore, finally, I think the question which emerges And that question is general. I mean, this might have emerged in one particular mind from the experience of one particular group, but these three questions of necessity, sufficiency, and principle of coherence are quite generalizable. And in this sense, if we want to define or if we want to understand what is education studies, what kind of knowledge and practice base is necessary in it, what would be more or less sufficient, and what would be the thread which will run through it, which will make it coherent field of study. To think on this, perhaps we'll have to think of education, but before that, a tentative demarcation of domain from another way perhaps is possible. I believe it will make sense to say that education studies will have to include all aspects of education in a society. When we are talking of education studies, there is a national education system and something is going on there and people are going to go in that system and work there. Therefore, perhaps all aspects of national education have to be included in that. And that would include the schools and what goes on there, curriculum, pedagogy, systems of schools, administration, policy, research, and various kinds of things. Broadly speaking, though I'm not suggesting any neat division in sense of, not having relationship with each other, but perhaps the old way of looking at or collecting them together in three different parts could be practice, theory, and institutional arrangements. I'm not implying here that practice and theory are disjointed or they don't have any influence on each other. But when we think of a teacher standing in front of the class and working there, the idea which comes to our mind basically is practice. And when we see two teachers discussing on it and some perspective from either psychology or sociology, then the idea which comes to our mind is theorizing about that practice. So in that kind of very tentative sense, perhaps we can say that all aspects of education that include practice, theory, and institutional arrangements, education study has to include all of them. Now, another idea is that when we are talking of particularly understanding the practice, one is engaging in the practice and developing the capability to engage with the practice, and another is understanding the practice or maybe evaluating the practice, whether it is going on well. Then it seems that we again have to do a bit of a theoretical thinking. And traditionally, as Professor Furlan just now was saying, philosophy of education, sociology of education, psychology of education, and history of education have been considered the kind of disciplines from where we get tools, concepts, and insights for doing this. Therefore, we can imagine a table. On one side, we can have practice, theory, and institutional arrangements. On other sides, we have these disciplines, and these disciplines have something to say, some perspective, some knowledge, some methods, some insights, and some skills for all three of them. So this becomes a very rough characterization of the domain of educational field in which we are talking. This list is not complete. Neither the aspects of education, that is practice, theory, and institutional arrangement, nor the disciplines, philosophy, psychology, etc. List can go on, but that is one way of looking at it. Also, there are contenders, apart from these established disciplines, various kinds of new perspectives which are emerging in the knowledge arena today. A feminist perspective in India, particularly Dalit and tribal studies and minority studies, they also have a claim in the theoretical space in education. If we think of all these knowledges or areas of knowledges coming together around practice, then how do we do we ensure that they will be coherent with each other? What is the principle around which we can sort of demand something from all these disciplines to adhere to some principle? What could be that principle? This problem actually in India, it seems to be quite old to me. There could be several kinds of threat to the unity of this discipline. And those threats could be from outside, political or economic pressures, but those threats could also be from inside. Professor Furlong also notes one of the emerging threats from inside, and he thinks, in his book, he argues that education has to find its basic purposes and has to sort of adhere to them. At another place, he thinks that the over-specialization within education might fragment it. A similar kind of idea, without over-specialization, was expressed about this principle of coherence in University Education Commission in India about 63 years back. And it seems to me the problem is very relevant, and it actually points to a very potent force of internal disintegration of the education studies. University Education Commission in 1950 points out one big problem in teaching education in the universities. And it says that one peculiarity of education as a study at the university level is that in whichever direction, I'm quoting, that in whichever direction it is studied to an advanced level, the study tends to become something other than education. It turns into a study of philosophy or psychology or history or sociology. And it loses its identity as study of education. It turns into something else. The Commission further notes that thus education studies at the university loses its focal point, and, I'm quoting again, the course will become distorted, even if the separate elements in the course are taught by quite learned and competent philosophers, psychologists, historians, and sociologists. For if they are not continually aware of the professional needs of their students will rightly feel that there is no unity in the course and that different specialists are simply trying to drag them in different directions. It seems to me that it might be giving a more or less accurate picture of many courses or many programs in education even today. In spite of this being a very old statement, we don't seem to have so far found a way of integrating them very well. Now, education, it seems to me, Commission, it seems to me here is pointing towards three things: disintegration of the course, disorientation of the student, and further down, they also say something about the faculty. They say that the learned faculty without a focus, according to the Commission, tends to regret the fact that they are only teaching education students and will all the time be wishing that they were instead teaching straight history or psychology or philosophy or whatever it is. So I am only teaching these education students. I would like to teach philosophers. I would like to teach psychologists. So they will also, in their own mind, be dissatisfied. So it seems that disintegration, disorientation of students, and dissatisfaction of the faculty. And that completes the picture of disintegration of education studies in itself. Now, Commission gives a very simple solution which would look very simplistic in the beginning, but I think, and I'll argue, that that's a good solution. Commission gives a solution to this, and it says, But before that, let me make a comment that this is not an issue of only over specialization in the internal. The disciplines mentioned, philosophy, history, psychology, and sociology, it seems that they have their specific ways of looking at the world. They have their perspective and their recognized differences in the epistemologies. And therefore, this seems to be inherent in the very nature of education studies. The problem is that if you do away with these different perspectives of these disciplines, then they become too sanitized and they don't contribute anything to education. And if you allow them to retain their epistemology and their perspective and the way they are looking at the world and their research orientation, then they fragment education or educational study. So one has to find a way in which those specific points or important aspects of their own epistemological orientation could be kept and strengthened, and at the same time they could be integrated into the educational studies. Commission gives a solution, which I was saying that looks very simplistic in the beginning, but to my mind is pretty good and adequate. I'll argue that. So Commission also suggests a starting point for creating such a unity, at the least intellectual, if not epistemic unity. And I'll make a difference between the two. What the Commission suggests is, while the fact of study of education tends to become something other than education, makes it easy for the pedantically minded to deny that education is a real subject. It remains true that education is an essential focal point for the various studies and skills necessary for tending teachers. It is also true and important, but by no means always recognized in Indian training departments and training colleges, that those responsible for training teachers must themselves look at the whole course from this focal point. That is, and now they are giving the focal point, the place of the school in the nation's life and the right training of children in the school. Commission seems to be saying that on the face of it, when you have these disciplines, people might think that education is not a real subject. I believe the term subject is being used here either for discipline or for field of study, which is not very clear in the Commission's report, but we will interpret it. Another thing that they are saying that this still has a focal point, and the criteria they are giving is understanding the place of schools in nation's life and the right training for the children. You can replace the place of education in the nation's life or human life and right kind of education or good quality education in the schools. So if one takes these two focal points, then can one address this disintegration? One thing they are addressing is that education should be seen as a unified discipline or field of study. And the identified principle is to do with education and its centrality to the society. They are also saying that the teachers of various sub-disciplines have to see and respect this unity, which means that there might be some implications for their teaching of their own disciplines. And then the teachers have to strive to force this unity in the mind of their students. So that seems to be the remedy which the Commission is proposing for this. It seems to me that if we take this criteria and unpack it a little bit, then perhaps this can give us a criteria for coherence, and that anything which is relevant and enhances our capability to act and capability to understand in relationship with place of education in the national life and improving the quality of education, that is better teaching and learning in the classroom, that is part of educational studies. And anything which is not related directly is not a necessary part of education studies. That still could be part of education studies for various kinds of other purposes and arguing or advocacy of education studies, but that is not an essential part of education studies. So that seems to be the general principle which seems to be emerging from here. Now, to work it slightly better, this is very rough at this moment, this just gives us a direction. It seems to me that that gives us coherence, but not necessarily necessity and sufficiency. So what is absolutely necessary to understand that, and what would be sufficient, how do we find that out? Three things which are said emerge out of this small sentence, as I'm repeating: place of education in national life, good education in school, and capabilities to realize good education and understand the place of education in national life. So how do we find out what is relevant for these three things to do? I'm not very certain, but I'm proposing something here. It seems to me that we can ask 6 or 7 direct questions, and the things which help us answer those questions could be considered necessary for this. The questions which emerge out of this criteria seem to be something like that. I'll read them. What is national life? And if we want to see broad in a broader canvas, then what is human life actually? So, but at this moment we will stick to what is national life and what is desired or aspired for national life. That points us to a certain notion of life and certain kind of preferences how our society and polity should be organized. One question we have to ask is necessarily, what is education? Because we are thinking in the arena of education, and without actually demarcating and having some tool to understand that, this may not be possible to go forward. And obviously, simultaneously with what is education, what is the place of that chosen concept of education in the national life which we aspire for? The third question seems to me, what are the aims of education? In this kind of national life, and if this is what we understand by education, what should be the aims of education? The fourth could be, what should be taught to achieve those aims of education? How would we ensure that our students achieve those aims? What is the content? Content is somewhat misleading word. I'm using here it for knowledge content as well as methodology as well as conceptual understanding and everything which goes under the heading knowledge. And fifth could be, how should the above mentioned content be taught? That leads us to pedagogy and methodology of how education should be done. The sixth question could be, how to assess our success in achieving 3, 4, and 5. That is, achieving aims, teaching the content, and what kind of methodology we are using. Are we happy with that? This leads us to assessment, but more particularly to, if we think of in broad terms, then research in education. Research of education is perhaps related to, if you take all the questions from 1 to 5, research mostly perhaps is related to these kinds of things. And perhaps a seventh question could be, what kind of institutional arrangements will be required to do all this, which we have, about which we have asked questions from in 1 to 6. Now, obviously, questions 3 to 6, that is, aims of education, content of education, methods of education, and research and assessment. They are actually a paraphrase on Ralph Taylor's questions about curriculum and instruction. But they need not be limited. We need not interpret them in the limited sense of asking about instruction and curriculum only. If you look at Ralph Taylor's answers, then those answers also somehow seem to remind you of behaviorism too strongly and too often. So answers to these questions need not necessarily come from behaviorist psychology. There are various other aspects. Now the argument I would build around this thing is that anything which gives answers to these questions is necessary. These questions are asked, or this criteria is also given in context with the teachers in the commission report. So can one generalize, is it the knowledge for the teacher or is it knowledge for everyone working in the field of education, for the researcher, for policy analyst, for curriculum designer, for pedagogue, for the headmaster? Is it knowledge for everyone or is it just for the teacher? Are we narrowing down the education to teaching? I don't think so. Often we hear that a good teacher, and if you look at many people who have talked about the knowledge base for teachers, right from Huss to Peters and Sulman more specifically, that teacher need to have something of a researcher in her also. But often the reverse statement is not made, that researchers need to have something of a teacher in herself. I think if we had that, then much of the research which we are debating today in India about assessment and several other things would have been much more informed. So it seems to me that this is the kind of knowledge base which everyone, a policy analyst or administrator or researcher, I don't have time to build that argument, but this argument could be built that this is absolutely necessary. I will leave certain things out because time is limited. I'll jump to certain, how do we come to disciplines from here? There are a few more things, but for the time being, I'm leaving that. In answering these kinds of questions, one would require certain conceptual repertoire. One will require certain ways of thinking. One will require some certain ways of building arguments and certain ways of how things are justified, what things are considered acceptable or true. And when you look at the kinds of assumptions and kinds of methodologies and concepts are being used to answer these questions, then you see that they are coming from very diverse sources. For example, if you ask what is the best pedagogy, you will get several answers. Some certain answers will come from the experimental psychology. What are the kinds of things which children can learn at what age? And what are the necessary conditions for learning that? But then there are also ethical questions about pedagogy. Those answers are not going to come from psychology. Though history and sociology may throw some light on that, but finally one has to turn to whether, for example, whether corporal punishment should be allowed in the classroom or not. I don't think we can get an answer from the psychology to this. You will have to go to something else, perhaps ethics. So it seems that the ways of looking at experimental research and ways of arguing about ethics might be a wide gap between the two. And a person whom we're demanding that should have this knowledge should have acquaintance with all these concepts for both of them. If you collect these concepts and epistemic methodologies, and here I might be on thin ice, but I'll still claim that perhaps majority of these concepts and epistemological methods come from philosophy, sociology, psychology, and some from history. Majority of the concepts which we use are coming from that side. But then there is an implication Because the original question was that when education starts being studied in the universities, then it always becomes something else. So we are actually completing the circle and again coming there. Which means that the character of these disciplines has to be changed if they are going to contribute to education up to a certain extent. Therefore, philosophy of education cannot be the same thing as philosophy in general. And in the interest of time, I'll just give one example of philosophy of education, and I would sort of argue that it could be generalized. How the nature of these disciplines will be changed, I believe we can turn to Dewey, who gives us a good criteria. Dewey about the philosophy of education says, Dewey says that philosophy of education is not an external application of ready-made ideas to a system of practice, having a radically different origin and purpose. It is only an explicit formulation of the problems of the formation of right mental and moral habitudes in respect of the difficulties of the contemporary social life. So the recommendation here is not that you have found some tools and some knowledge from the philosophy, the parent discipline, and you bring that, import that into education and apply it. The issue is philosophizing about the education itself. The issue is formulating the issues which are emerging in the day-to-day practical education in a particular society, thinking philosophically about that. Therefore, maybe the epistemologically you are using philosophical methods, but actually the questions and concepts you are shaping that are emerging from the education. If one takes this attitude, then the philosophy of education recognizes that this is a subdiscipline, or may not be subdiscipline, a discipline within the field of study of education. And therefore, this might have certain characteristics which are not in the parent philosophy. This might have some very direct questions and implications. And part of the repertoire of philosophical knowledge might be more useful, and certain parts of the philosophical knowledge may be less useful. And that perhaps is applicable to all disciplines. The last thing in the given time I'll talk about this is, does this make education a discipline if one thinks in this manner? It doesn't seem to me. It seems to me that this education still remains a larger field of study which gets contribution from various disciplines, the disciplines who are somehow relevant with those 5 or 6 fundamental questions and which can contribute to that. And they can bring their epistemology, etc. within education. Therefore, it's basically a multidisciplinary field, but united with a purpose, with a certain kind of domain, with a community of people who are studying education, and various kinds of other social formation. Therefore, the unity perhaps could be called, one can call an intellectual coherence, because intellectual coherence comes from this purpose and situation in the society. But education studies may not have epistemic coherence in the sense of using a particular theory or particular way of justification and finding truth, or a particular kind of argumentation. This necessarily will have to use varieties of kinds of argumentation and epistemic tools. The last thing I would say in this is, imposing the criteria of a discipline on education studies might actually empower it. This might make it a stronger, cohesive group of people with a certain kind of identity. But in the long run, perhaps the flow of ideas and interaction with other disciplines might be hampered, and one would like to, constantly people will like to develop a kind of general theory or general epistemology, and therefore the the rich resources which are available elsewhere in human knowledge perhaps would be there might be a resistance to using them. Therefore, it seems to me that trying to fashion a discipline out of education studies may not be a good thing for education studies. However, having a unifying and coherence principle is an absolute necessity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dhankar, who reminds us that education is about something, teaching and learning, and therein lies the intellectual coherence. Professor Dhankar prefers to have a series of questions and collect them. So, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. At a time. Okay, we're on this side of the room. There's over here.
Good morning, sir. Sir, it seems that, as just you have said, that education is it is borrowing, like it's a very different kind of discipline which borrows everything from the other disciplines. So the problem is, if we take out this philosophy, sociology, history, economics, everything out of this discipline, will there be something left as it will be called as education itself? Or it is something like a mythological reference of Mahishasura-Mardini, where it was the energy of all gods created together and she was embodied as a Mahishasura-Mardini, the great goddess. So shall we take it as a limitation of this discipline or the strength of this discipline? I think it should be the strength itself. Sir. Comment, please.
Question 2 is over here someplace.
Rohitji, as usual, I mean, in your presentation, there's a huge normative dimension, which is, of course, very, very desirable, and we should be constantly thinking what education should be. But I do not currently see much space for critiquing what's happening today, which means, I mean, as if you quoted Dewey, and he said that, okay, it should fulfill the needs of the contemporary society. So where in your formulation do you see, how do we critique what is happening, what is education doing currently, what it shouldn't be doing, what's really happening in classrooms and outside classrooms and schools and in tuition classes and in teachers being kept as para-teachers and etc., etc., etc. There's a whole lot of troubled questions. What should be is fine, but what is?
I think question 3 was here.
Sir, to answer those 5 questions and the last one, how should be the institution for that? So I'm just thinking, if we are thinking at the systemic level, what are the things we needed and how that should be, the systemic arrangement of that for that kind of institution.
And question 4.
I like your idea very much that education is a field, maybe the queen of the humanities. And my question is why you don't use the word science. It seems to me that the sciences don't have much intellectual coherence, and perhaps education should be the queen of the sciences.
I believe that I tried to answer the first question for about 40 minutes. But let me say 1 or 2 small things on that. No, I didn't say that education is something which is nothing but borrowed things collected together. What I said that education is a practice in a society and which raises certain questions, and those questions have to be deliberated upon, and the kind of practice we get into that has to be informed by the perspective. Now those perspectives, in thinking about those questions, we borrow concepts as well as ways of argumentation and justification, etc., from various fields. So that is borrowing in the sense or using the tools or ways of knowledge formation available to humans for the education, for the field of education. So I don't think I was talking of borrowing, and if everything is left, then there is no education. But if you don't use any other human knowledge, then I don't understand how one can reflect. So whatever we reflect upon, we have to use human knowledge from somewhere or other. Beyond that, I don't think that education is just a collected thing. As I said at the end, this is very strongly unified in its purpose and its domain. I don't know where could it be implied, at least I certainly didn't want, that the critique of the present should not be there. At this moment, we were simply talking about, for example, what was the second question? What is place of education in the national life? How do I deliberate on this question, and how many hundreds of questions this might generate? This immediately brings in what is education doing to those children you are referring about the tuition, etc. Or what is happening to in tribal areas in the name of education? Are we excluding them? All these questions become part of place of education in national life. Now, this was a short paper, and I was trying to list these questions in a very sort of brief manner, therefore one cannot go into those details. But I don't think that anywhere it was implied that critique is not possible. Or also, when Dewey is saying that reflecting on the questions of contemporary society, at this place he is not talking of perpetuating the society. Actually, Dewey's contention is that philosophy emerges when there is conflict in ideas and when there is conflict at the level of practice. Therefore, the critique and by philosophy, Dewey understands through an analysis and critique, finding a unifying principle at a higher level. So therefore, critique is built into this. So I do not know why this whatever I said should be seen as.
Can I respond?
No, I don't know that. The chair will have to tell. Then, what kind of institutions? Well, I don't know. I have been sort of advocating that everyone working in education should know about all these questions and should have certain ideas, but sorry to confess, I don't know much about what kind of institutions should be built. I do have some general ideas, but you also have those ideas. Schools and various kinds of institutions and their character. I don't have anything much to say on that. Why it shouldn't be called science? One doesn't know in what sense science being used. In a certain way, even metaphysics could be called science and has been called science in the history. But if we are talking of something like physics, then education is certainly not that kind of science which is investigating something which is already given, and you have to form patterns of thought which exactly try to match it. Education has, as Vansumala was saying, a huge normative aspect, and actually education, to my mind, is more about what ought to be done rather than what is being done. So I don't think education could be called science in that sense.
4 questions, oh my. Let's see, there's 1 and 2, maybe 3. I want to be equitable here. 4, okay.
I have a feeling that the conception of education studies you have drawn from the Commission's report may have conservative consequences. In that, to begin with, the notion of education as contributing to national life exposes it to the same dangers that medical education faces. A lack of a kind of a normative conception of the person, which can give a foundation to medicine as a practice of healing, and therefore in the same way, the absence of a conception of the person being educated, which exposes you to certain more instrumental approaches to what education would be. And the choice of subjects that are necessary, sociology or economics, philosophy of course, unless you broaden that to include a much more normative conception of the person, can lead to either unending controversy about what education studies is, or a facile instrumental compromise.
Question 2, I think was right here.
What is your I was wondering what would be your response to courses in an MA education program which are not seemingly true to disciplines such as sociology, psychology, etc., but instead
what was the word you used?
Your response to formulating courses in an MA education program, courses, which are not true to or not seemingly true to disciplines such as sociology, psychology, etc., but are conceptualized based on what could be true to education such as curriculum studies, schooling, teaching, learning, etc. What would be your response to that?
Thank you. Question 3 was there, right?
So, sir, I have some confusion now when you mentioned about specialization in education, and then that is going to distort the field itself. So I just wanted you to elaborate on it, as in what did you mean by that conception of specialization in education?
There was a question here, and I also pointed to someone over here.
Yeah.
It was you. Yeah, so it's 5. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Rohitji, my question basically is when we approach, I'm here. Okay, I'm sorry. No. I thought that you're just trying to look it. No. So my basic question is like somebody who's like, I am also somebody who comes from this development studies, who has done like interdisciplinary kind of approaches. So sometimes there is a fundamental problem when you are into a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary like teaching or learning process, where if it is not grounded in a discipline to actually approach a subject, it becomes like you're quite limited within the scope. So should it actually be based in a discipline from where you can expand your horizon and like look at everything? But at the same time, there might be certain novelty to the idea of also like answering certain questions which you actually raised. But when we are, but that might also has its own limitations. So I see that there is a certain kind of contestation between like two kinds of things going on. I don't know if yeah.
And a brief question 5, and there are many questions for tea time. Who has the microphone for 5?
Hi, I think the last decade or so there has been like great sense of sort of anxiety, disciplinary anxiety in particular about education in India, and I think we will be well served to also look at what went on in the 1960s, particularly when disciplines such as gender studies or feminist studies, which were like education, were in the periphery of bigger disciplines such as sociology, and they sort of carved out their own tools, their own analysis. And I think one way in which that took place was that the feminist studies or gender studies created their own discursive spaces, and that in turn also changed the way sociology was being done. I think that would be a good way to look at as education battles these sort of disciplinary, survival issues. Second point or comment I have, I'll be really quick, is perhaps we should really read carefully our own 19th century works on education as to why Ramabai or Phule were so invested in education, partly because it is so fundamentally transformative. And I think that is much better and much unique way to justify than sort of framing education within national life, which is acritical, which is also to certain extent conservative.
I'm sorry, it seems that I'm a very poor communicator. I was not talking or defining education at all. I didn't even touch that. I just mentioned that in one question, what is education? That question needs to be asked. That's all. I was trying to understand what could be education studies. Now one can argue that without understanding education fully, you cannot talk about what education studies is, which is true to my mind. But I think certain questions could be asked. And therefore, I don't think that I said that education, definition of education should be built on the national, or on commission, or on the national life. I said there seems to be a clue in the commission, and we can develop from that clue. So that was more as a reference. And that reference, now the claim I'm making is nothing to do with national life and any education commission in any country. Claim I'm making is, if we want to carve out a coherent understanding of education studies, then keep the place of education in human life and what is good education, keep these two questions in the center. If we keep these two questions in the center, then we will have to ask this question: what is education, for whom this education is, and therefore concept of a person and human being, and what kind of education would be useful for that human being. I believe all the normativity will come tumbling, or maybe you will have to work hard, but that will come in this. Yes, there shall be unending controversies. Unfortunately, that cannot be avoided. Nor do I think that that is such a bad thing. Constant kind of re-looking at the ideas is a good thing. But if we are doing that re-looking in a given framework, then there is a possibility of progress. That's what I'm hinting at. Also, please remember, I just mentioned 4 disciplines tentatively. I said that real issue is answering these questions. And in answering these questions, you are using concepts and methodologies and various kinds of things from several disciplines. And that has to be worked out. Therefore, the issue of courses like curriculum studies are basically drawing from several other actually 3 questions are directly related to curriculum studies, which I listed. And they will draw from various kinds of discipline and fields of human knowledge. I don't see any problem there at all. Yes, my idea, you see why I was quoting that narrow specialization might actually fragment. That is not about the specializations we usually have in the courses. That was someone specializes, say, teaching mathematics to 5th standard children. I don't want to give real examples that might hurt people, so I'm trying to cook up an example which is not very good. So there could be very narrow specialization to do with pedagogy or various kinds of things. And that, overemphasis in that might fragment it. That was the idea, not the general specialization in, say, pedagogy or curriculum or teaching. Not that was not the idea. No, I forgot one question. I have scribbled something, not grounded in, it's, you see, the idea is not that, Manohar's question. The idea is, I'm trying to combine 2 ideas. One, the questions arising out of the needs of education, and in thinking about those questions, utilizing the knowledge base and ways of investigation available in various kinds of disciplines. So this is neither straight borrowing nor actually an injection on any discipline. So I do not know. I think one important point is why I would prefer to have identities of disciplines, like philosophy of education, etc., precisely for the point that they don't bring only concepts and particular kind of knowledge base alone. They also bring with them an epistemology and methodology which is useful in education. Therefore, integrating them and bringing in philosophical, sociological, psychological ideas into one integrated kind of thing, sometimes at this moment, it seems to me that will do harm to education studies, because you will have the knowledge generated by someone with certain kind of epistemology, but you will not have the means to examine that knowledge and take this forward. So you need both these things simultaneously. That's the kind of thing I'm arguing. Part of the answer I have given that yes, Ramabai and Phule should be read, but then I was not looking at education at this moment. I was looking at education studies. And yes, obviously the new studies which bring out the contradictions and problems in the society, like gender studies or Dalit studies, obviously they have a place in education, and certainly they might have changed sociology. So this is a dynamic process. The sociology of education becomes a changed sociology. That is another reason why we should keep identity of these disciplines. Because the growth of knowledge in the parent discipline will constantly interact with the education studies if that is there. If we just dismantle them, then the possibility of utilizing the growth in these disciplines further will be hampered to my mind. Thank you.
Two wonderful papers. Please join me in thanking Professor Furlong and Professor Dhankar very much. And I wish we had more time.